Shen is going to go ahead and flip off of his own barrier. Now this is important because this means that now that the Shen is flipped, when we use Stand United, both units are going to get +3/+3. And our Caretaker is going to pop off as well. Hey guys, what is up? Swim here, and I've got a fresh new deck for you. This is the Barrier OTK deck. This is my version of it. Now, this is not a horrendously original deck. You guys might have seen a lot of the decks on this channel, and some of them are, you know, like more unique. Like, you know, Fiora, Braum, All-In is pretty tasteful, pretty flavorful. I didn't see a single person running anything like that. Marauders, Shadow Isles, kind of same thing. And even like the Dawn Spiders, I didn't see anything really close to that, although I'm sure there were some people messing with similar concepts. This is a Fiora barrier deck that you have probably seen some variation of on ladder, although I believe this to be a very refined version of this concept. Probably, I dare say, more refined than, well, any I've seen at least. So, to break this down, firstly, I will say this is probably not a super powerful deck. I expect this, and, you know, it's hard to say, I expect this to be one of the weaker decks that I've showcased on this channel, maybe the weakest one. This would probably stabilize at like a tier 3. You're actually still able to win some games for sure, and keep in mind, tier 3 is still competitive. The vast majority, I think I want to clear this up real quick. There's a lot of people that will look at like a tier 3 deck or sometimes even a tier 2 deck and be like, I'll just play a tier 1 deck. In reality, when you're actually talking about competitive tier breakdowns, a tier 3 deck is still a competitive tier of deck. You see these decks brought to tournaments in any card game. There will sometimes be tier 3 decks if they have like good matchup tables or they suit your lineup or something like that. These are still competitive decks. They have a few less win percentage on their win rate than, you know, some other decks, but they're fine. You know, I won't be playing this on day one unless I do. Maybe I want to have fun. So, you know, if you're really min-maxing, sure, pick a tier 1 deck, but I don't want to discourage a lot of people that are okay losing a few percentage points off their win rate from playing a tier 3 deck, because the thing to understand is the vast majority of decks that almost anybody like randomly makes and just random decks that exist are like tier 4, tier 5 kind of like more unplayable decks, right? Tier 3 is still a competitive tier, okay? So this is probably not as strong as other decks I've showcased, but it makes up for that by being, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, I would say the single most fun deck that I've showed off so far. And there have actually been a few fun ones. If you're a super degenerate, you might have found the Shadow Isles Super Combo OTK to be a lot more fun. But while this deck is lower power level, this is the most fun deck I have had personally for how I consider fun to be playing Runeterra. As always, I'm going to go ahead and spend a while breaking this list down. If you want to check out the comments, I'm going to leave a pinned comment. That's going to go to the Mobalytics page where I have this deck stored. That's important because as I make edits to this deck, I'm going to update that page, but I can't update this video. So if you want to check out a fully updated daily, like every time I make changes, I will update these pages. Check out the link there. And also, if you want to skip this little deck building nonsense, honestly, you've probably done so already. What are you doing? We're like 2 minutes into this video. Just get to the gameplay. Okay, let's actually talk about the deck build itself. Let's get deep into this and break this down. So, probably the most singularly specific thing about this deck, and some other decks have done this, is that we're running Kinko Wayfinder. Now, there's some Fiora Barrier Shen decks that don't run Kinko Wayfinder, but I think it's probably too important here to not run. So Kinko Wayfinder, obviously, Allegiance summon 2 1-cost allies from her deck. With 9 to 31, you're looking at Allegiance odds of hitting of roughly 77.5%. I mean, if you're a math nerd, you'll argue it's a little different, but it's almost 80% basically of hitting, and it's going to be trying to pull 2 Green Glade Caretakers when it hits. Green Glade Caretaker being the big build around concept of this deck. When an ally gets barrier, grant me +2/+0. We're going to spam a lot of barriers, and these Green Glade Caretakers are going to be big. I dare say this might actually be a bigger win condition for this deck than Fiora. So you're going to spam a lot of barriers, you're going to get Green Glade Caretakers big, maybe you're going to get Fiora kills, and then you're going to close the game out by usually using Stand United on a Green Glade Caretaker, okay? This swaps 2 allies, so it swaps their position. So that means, you know, you're thinking like a pretty common state on turn 6 or turn 7 of the game. You've developed a board, you're pushing your advantage, you declare an attack, your opponent declares blockers, and then you Stand United to swap your, by now, like 15 attack Green Glade Caretaker into an empty slot so that you're basically making it unblocked, and then it smacks them and kills them in one, right? Very, very common win condition for this deck. But you've also got the Fiora package. If you've watched videos on this channel, you know I'm in love with this card. I think, to be honest, it's a fairly competitive card, although the decks that play more for this condition tend to be less competitive than decks just use her for her just like generally solid body. You know, she's 3/3 challenger is just great. It gets all kinds of places. And you've got, of course, Judgment as well as a big finisher for Fiora. To go back to Green Glade Caretaker, one important thing to note about Kinko Wayfinder, that if you're looking at this deck, you're probably asking me already, Swim, you've got an Inspiring Mentor. How do you have an Inspiring Mentor when you've got Kinko Wayfinder? Well, let me break this down for you, because that's actually a great question. I think Inspiring Mentor is fantastic in this deck. And there's a few reasons for that. This deck needs a turn 1 play pretty badly. You don't really want to be floating mana here. So having one mentor actually helps your odds for that. It's something to keep in your opening mulligan, you know, obviously. It's kind of nice to buff a Caretaker or a Fiora. On top of that, your Kinko Wayfinder is only even hitting its allegiance, like, you know, 77% of the time, right? So it's not 100% of the time. And most importantly, when your Wayfinder hits the allegiance, you're not, you know, you still might be hitting 2 Caretakers, even if you haven't drawn Mentor, even if Mentor is still your deck. And finally, and the most important thing to understand about this decision, is when Kinko Wayfinder activates, and if I pull at least 1 Caretaker, which I'm guaranteed to, I don't really mind that much if my other pull is a Mentor. That's fine, right? Because Green Glade Caretaker, I only need 1 of it, it's going to go off, it's going to get big, and it's going to win me the game with, like, Stand United, right? And that, I think, is the most important thing to understand about, you know, deck building fundamentals 101. You want to help conditions that your deck is weaker against, right? This is something that I think most kind of like intermediate level card game players understand, which is the idea of, you know, play for situations where you're weaker rather than situations where you're stronger. Like, assume you're a bit weaker than you are and, you know, play towards that, right? That's something that is pretty intuitive. But, you know, check this out. So in the circumstances where I have a Kinko Wayfinder and it hits, you know, I'm able to develop it and it pulls out a Caretaker or, you know, at least 1 Caretaker, I'm already very happy in those situations and I don't need the second Caretaker on top of that, right? So deck building and play patterns, this logic applies to both and you need to make this connection. But the idea is you kind of like steal value from situations where you're already very happy, you know, you've got a good win percentage, to help situations where you've got a lower win percentage. And that's where Mentor comes in, because this deck can struggle when you have, you know, these spots where, you know, you're lacking a turn one play, or, you know, you need a buff or something like that, right? Also, there are some hands where sometimes you'll draw 2 Caretakers and a Kinko, and then your Kinko will just get a +1/+1 for free, right? Because the Mentor will be there as well. That can happen sometimes as well. Okay, now let's just talk about the rest of the cards in the deck in order, and of course at the end we're going to talk about the cards that aren't in this deck, because that's also very important. There's a couple of cards that you might be wondering, hey, Swim, why isn't this in the deck? And hey, I'll explain, because I've gone through every consideration while making this deck, and every card has purpose. So let's get to Rush. Rush at 1 mana combat trick is a burst speed to give 1 attack and quick attack this round. Phenomenally powerful combat trick. This card might be more than one of in this list. If you look in the description at the Mobalytics link, you actually might find that this card is more than a one of already at the time that this video is being posted. We'll see. But Rush is a card that basically will save you for your health. It'll bail you out of situations. There's a lot of spots where your opponent puts you on, like, you know, a Fiora barrier deck. You attack with Fiora. You know, you've got 1 mana floating, and they're like, you know, they might take a block in that spot because you only have 1 mana left. But of course, then you get Rush value. So it's a phenomenal card for how cheap it is. It just does so much. Green Glade Duo is just one of the reasons to be in Ionia, a super powerful card that actually I'm thinking about cutting down in this list a little bit. As good as Green Glade Duo is, it's an amazing, amazing pressure tool. One big weakness here is, you know, it's really weak against Vile Feast. That's actually Green Glade Duo's weakness in general. Vile Feast is a really, really, really powerful tool. It's basically an auto-include in Shadow Isles, and Shadow Isles it's a pretty good region, by the way. You're gonna see a lot of Shadow Isles. I'll tell you right now. Okay, so You're going to see a lot of Vile Feast, and Vile Feast has a phenomenal trade into Green Glade Duo, so that is going to be a little bit unfortunate for Duo when that happens, but the ability to basically just pepper down your opponent for amazing amounts of value at 2 mana and sticking this to the board is pretty solid nonetheless. Key Guardian, grant barrier to an ally in hand to draw 1. This is a card that's fairly weak in a normal deck, but works pretty well here. One important thing to remember about Key Guardian is that anything that kind of triggers off of the barrier will be triggered when the card gets played. So for example, Green Glade Caretaker, this doesn't get buffed when the Key Guardian gets activated, it gets buffed when the card with barrier gets played to board. Basically, Key Guardian doesn't actually give barrier to an ally in hand, it gives a note to the ally in hand that it gets barrier when it gets played, right? And of course it cantrips itself, drawing 1, so this is fine. One important thing to note about Key Guardian is if you do give the barrier to a Green Glade Caretaker, it will buff itself off of its own barrier when it goes on the board, right? But for the most part, it's just kind of like a value tool. It just goes into the whole like barrier package, right? You're just getting a little bit more value out of barrier, and you're drawing a card while you're doing it. The drawing a card is important in this deck because it's a very combo-y style deck, and you need to be hitting your pieces, right? Got 2 single combat at this point in time. Single combat makes a lot of sense in this deck because, of course, Fiora, can use it to, get her kills count online to potentially get a win. But on top of that, single combat also has the ability to be very well with barriers. And there's a specific reason for that. One big reason for, single combat is basically you can be looking at, the big barrier on something like Green Glade Caretaker, and then if the opponent chooses to not block, you've got a proactive barrier that's coming from Key Guardian or Shen, something not happening at burst speed. The opponent might not block it, and then when they don't block it, you've got a barrier that's lasting for that round that's not really doing anything else, right? So you're like, okay, I can use single combat there, I can turn that barrier into removal, right? So single combat ends up making sense in this deck. Could possibly be a 3 of in later revisions, but I think 3 is a little dicey here. It's not as hyper necessary, and it also hurts our Kinko odds. Deny. You guys know about Deny. So Deny is a pretty overrated card. Actually, this is a card that is fairly powerful, not a 3 of in every deck. I think there's actually some decks that will run this card at more like a 0 of. It really depends on the meta state. But in this kind of deck, this card is absolutely a 3 of, 100%. Because this deck plays fairly slow, and you've also got like combos that are a bit susceptible to getting denied out. So, maybe you want to protect your judgment from deny, and you can use deny to stop that deny from happening, right? There's a fair amount of cards in this deck that are a little bit susceptible in that way, things that are just vulnerable to removal. Maybe I don't want my Green Glade Caretaker getting like removed, or I don't want to let my opponent, mess with my plans. I've got a very specific game plan, and hey, Deny is great in decks like that, especially if they play a little bit slower. Fiora, a woman who needs no introduction. This is very quickly becoming maybe my favorite champion in the game. She's great. You guys might have noticed I've literally posted 3 different Fiora decks on this channel in the past like 5 days, 4 days maybe. I don't know. It's unhealthy, honestly, my obsession. As good as she is, and she does hit a lot of like non-Fiora decks as well. Very important to note that, you can run her just as a 3/3/3 challenger, a perfectly fantastic stat line, by the way. You don't need more than a 3/3/3 challenger, right? So what more is there to say about her? I mean, you just ramp up on kills, get value, barrier, protector, and just win games, right? Prismatic Barrier. Give an ally a barrier this round. Obviously, this ends up being good in the deck because this is just kind of the quintessential barrier card. 3 mana for a burst speed barrier means you're going to be countering a lot of interactions, right? The burst is important because it's not deniable. So you're going to be able to just protect your Fiora, protect your Green Glade Caretaker. Again, these are your 2 win conditions. Either Fiora is going to go off and just kill the Nexus on her own, or Green Glade Caretaker will find some way to punch through, right? Scaled Snapper, phenomenal card, definitely a 3 of in this list. This list is thirsty for proactive Ionia plays because it needs to keep its ratios right. And this is just a phenomenal card. It's basically the same as Golden Crushbot. Golden Crushbot from PNZ. A lot of people look at Golden Crushbot and think it's a worse version of Scaled Snapper, and it's the same thing, really. I mean, you pretty much always play the Snapper as a 2/5, and in reality, I mean, they're the same card. If you want a Snapper in PNZ, play Crushbot. I think a lot of people feel bad about Crushbot because it doesn't have a few extra words on it, and they're the same card. They really are. If you're not in Ionia and you want a Snapper, put in Crushbot, okay? But a 3-2-5 is a phenomenal stat line. It's great against aggro decks in general. For decks that want to slow down the game against something that might want to burn you down very quickly, hey, I've got Scaled Snapper. I've got a guaranteed 2-for-1 at 3 mana, possibly, you know, a 3-for-1 as well. If I just like chump like 2 attack units all day, we can go 3-for-1. And that's just ridiculous trades at that point, right? So enough said about this card, and you can definitely imagine some super niche scenarios where you play it as a 5-2, especially with Barrier. Like, that can happen sometimes. It's going to be rare spots. When in doubt, don't do it, but that can happen. Shadow Assassin. This card is surprisingly not as good as I thought it would be. I expected when I first played this game that this card would hit every Ionia deck, and it fits in surprisingly few, which is pretty crazy. But it's good in this deck. Like I said, we're thirsty for proactive Ionia cards. It represents draw power, which is important in more combo-y decks like this one. And, you know, I mean, there's not too much to say about this one. It's just like, you know, you play it on turn 3, turn 4 a lot of the time. Kinko Wayfinder. Of course, it's got the allegiance that this deck is partially built around. You're just going to be dropping it on turn 4, ideally in a lot of situations. Shen, I haven't talked too much about this one yet. Basically, he's kind of the barrier champion. When you have him on board and allies gain barrier 4 times, he gets the level up, which gives you additional attack. So the big thing about Shen and Greenglade Caretaker is that Shen is how Greenglade Caretaker gets so much attack. Because when the allies get barrier when he's leveled up, and he levels up pretty easily in this deck, that ally gets 3 attack this round. So it's similar to Caretaker. When an ally gets barrier, grant me +2/+0. A really, really big thing with Shen and Caretaker is that when you apply barrier to a unit that already has barrier, it counts both of their effects. Both of their effects will trigger off of that. So if I have a Caretaker at 10 attack and barrier, right, it already has barrier, and my opponent, you know, let's say they can't block it or something, and I've got Shen out. Then if I were to use Prismatic Barrier on that Caretaker, it would gain 5 more attack if I had a leveled Shen on the board, because it would trigger this effect still, even though it had barrier, and it would trigger Shen's effect too, which is only this round, but that's usually all you need. Spirit's Refuge, a pretty great 3-of. Getting lifesteal is actually a really good way to slow down games, and Greenglade Caretaker can hilariously heal you to like 20 health from like 2, right? Because an important thing to remember about lifesteal in this game is you can oversteal a unit's health. Like, if I attack with a big Caretaker who has like 17 attack, and my opponent chump blocks with a Spider, and I use Spirit's Refuge, it will full heal me. The Spirit's Refuge will make my Caretaker 19 attack, and that will heal me no matter what my health is. I'll go to 20 Nexus health, okay? So, Spirit's Refuge is another great way to stall down games. And then we've got Stand United and Judgment. Like I said, these are our big win conditions. Judgment as a 1-of scare card for Fiora is pretty nice. It will force the opponent to play differently, knowing that you might have Judgment. Or, yeah, when you have Fiora on board, they'll have to play weirdly. They can't attack with like more than 2 or 3 units at a time. It's just a good scare card, really. The one thing about Judgment to be aware of, you have to be very, very cognizant of opponents' removal abilities. Not just Deny, although Deny is a big one, but if they have the ability to respond to your Judgment with something in their region that maybe deals 3 damage, because the thing about Judgment is you usually tap out completely. So I would say if you're against a region that has the ability to deal 3 damage, like for example Shadow Isles, who has like Black Spear, maybe they have killed a unit already on their side, so they're open to Black Spear. Maybe wait on Judgment for a few turns. If you're looking to set up a good Judgment, of course, you don't always have this luxury, but if you're looking to set up a good Judgment, it can often be better to wait until you have a counter response, like your own Deny, to protect your Judgment on like turn 8 or 9 of the game when you have banked mana, right? And Stand United is just kind of that burst through with Greenglade Caretaker. Swap 2 allies will swap their positions. So if it's benched, it just swaps anything they're doing right now. Their positions in attacking, their spot on bench. If something challengers, you know, one of my units, I can swap that with something else with Stand United. It ends up actually being fairly cute in this deck. All right. And that's the build. Now let's talk a little bit about the cards that I don't have in this deck. Okay, so let's go to Chain Vest. Chain Vest is a card that I've run in Fiora decks in the past. I don't want to run too many Demacia cards in this case, and with Fiora, because I've got a lot of barriers in this version, it's very redundant with a tough effect. That being said, I do want to say with these cards, I'm not offering this as conclusive proof that they aren't proper in the deck. I'm just saying why I haven't run them in this. Okay, so Bright Steel Protector. So this is a card that I think is very, very common in these lists. Again, the Demacia card, I don't want to overload my allegiance odds, which is pretty important to me. But the fact that this is at slow speed just makes the barrier, like, fundamentally much, much, much less useful. And the fact that I'm not playing anything really early that this can curve into, right? Usually this deck is going to be floating its mana early. This card just ends up, I think, being a bit more clunky. I definitely could find some way to like sneak 1 or 2 copies of this in, but the idea of a slow speed barrier is just very diminished value, and the fact that it has the 2/3/2 body kind of doesn't do as much for the deck, because I often am like skipping the first turn or two typically, and I mean using it on Mentor doesn't really help either, right? My barriers kind of want to be coming in a little bit later. Some card you might see some people running in this deck is Ghost. I'm giving ally elusive this round. It's a funny way to punch through with Green Glade Caretaker, but the important mentality with Ghost is it's really only good when you have a big Caretaker on board anyway, and those are kind of situations where you're pretty much always winning, right? So again, think back to what we said at the beginning. We really don't want to run cards that are really only good when we have a stable board position, right? You can definitely imagine a situation where Ghost will make the difference, but it will be kind of rarer than, you might intuitively immediately think. And when you compare Ghost to Stand United, it kind of ends up being, when you see Stand United, it's like it ends up being the same thing as Ghost, really, because, it offers you that big punch through with Caretaker, but the one big difference is when you don't have a fully stable board, Stand United can help you swing back, right? That's the big difference between these cards. Stand United can be good when you aren't in control, whereas Ghost is never good if you aren't in control, right? So that's a good comparison there. And also keep in mind, we have 3 Shens, and that's going to give us basically Stand United equity, basically. One way to look at it. Because we have 3 Shens, it's sort of kind of like having 2.67 Stand Uniteds in our deck. When you math it out, the odds of drawing 2 Shens is about 0.67 of a Stand United, so obviously we have to also include for the areas where your Shen is going to die, but effectively just in terms of the draw power and our ability to find certain cards, we basically have 2.67 Stand Uniteds in our deck. And that's good enough. That's a totally fair amount. If anything, that might be too much. Maybe I only want 1.67, Okay, so now let's move on. River Shaper, another common card that you might see people running in these kinds of things. The idea is hilarious. When you offer a barrier on this card, it basically turns it into kind of a draw engine every time it hits. It's kind of made for this deck because you can kind of sort of like cantrip infinitely, basically. And I think this card is dangerously idealistic. Now I might have to give this a try. If there's ever a deck this can fit into, it would be this one, but it's really, really vulnerable. If the opponent has the ability to take it down, it's not going to be doing anything for you, and I don't really like where this card ends up. So I'll give it a try, but right now I don't want it in my stable list, because I simply think that it's not going to be reliable enough. I feel like it's just a little bit too answerable. And then the last common card that you might see is Twin Disciplines. This is a card that I actually just don't like this card. I think this is just a weak card. For 3 mana, you're not getting a lot out of this. You're not getting a lot of bang for your buck, right? I mean, you've got the flexibility, but it's really, really expensive for that. 3 mana is just pretty crazy. You're usually going to be playing this for health, right? So when you compare it to, let's go to Elixir of Iron. This is like a decent comparison. This is a pretty sweet card. It's okay. But basically, when you compare it to Elixir of Iron, you're paying 2 extra mana for, you get 1 more health, which matters. And you have, a chance of like 15% of situations maybe that you'll use it for the attack, which is really nice. And maybe it's higher than that because we're in the barrier deck. So maybe I should say 30% of situations, right? But 3 mana is really, really expensive, and it feels like you're overpaying for flexibility. Now, spot flexibility does matter, but the idea of like committing like an extra mana point beyond what that kind of card should be priced at just for that flexibility, I think makes it just a little bit too expensive, and the deck is already pretty overloaded on combat tricks, right? We have a very like reactive deck that's built around, oh, my opponent's going to do this, I'm going to play a combat trick, and that's why you've got barriers, and that's also, by the way, why I only have 1 rush at the current moment, because the synergy behind this deck is barrier, which is a combat trick, and you know, at this point in time, adding more combat tricks that aren't providing barrier synergy feels like I'm kind of overloading the amount of combat tricks I really want in a deck. It's going to clunk up my draws, and, you know, I'm not even going to get that really the synergy out of it that barriers are providing my deck. So I don't think it's anything special there. Anyway, that is my deck breakdown. We now, you know, understand exactly why this deck is the way it is in terms of, you know, how everything fits together. Let's go ahead and take this to ladder. It's not ladder, it's an elite spot. We're just going to be playing against the spider bot. Let's go. Okay, so we're gonna hit a human opponent, actually. This is timed with, and you'll see the next video that I'm actually putting out. It should be the video later today, I think, if you're watching. Yeah, that should be right. And basically, there's a spoiler alert. There's a little like Riot event where a lot of people that work at Riot and some people basically have designated a 3-hour time slot for people to queue on ladder, so we're actually able to hit a human being. Look at that, that's crazy. So we've got a pretty interesting hand. We have one Caretaker and Rush. I think I'd rather have more reliable combo pieces here. Let's take a look at what he's got. He's got Karma, Braum, and Ash. So we're gonna be attacking on turn 1 against Karma, Braum, and Ash. I think I will keep Caretaker. Karma, Braum, and Ash is not like a mainstream deck. It's a pretty strange deck. He's going to be like slowing the game down, maybe trying some kind of enlightenment, and also freezing me at the same time. It seems a little like caught in the middle. So I think we can open Caretaker on turn 1. I think this is pretty much just fine. Doesn't seem very vulnerable to anything specifically. And we already have a hand state that you might have remembered. I was talking about Inspiring Mentor in the deck. Check this out. Our Wayfinder, you know, if we didn't have that Mentor, would be pulling just a Caretaker, but now it's pulling a Caretaker and the other thing if we actually draw it. I'm okay taking this attack, obviously. Caretakers are important to protect, and therefore, you know, he might actually have taken this block, but we've got another one and potentially a third one in hand, so we're not really going to need it in this case. So he's got an attack position. He's not doing anything here. And I don't think I really want to push my luck here either. I do want to play Scaled Snapper on 3. I think that's pretty important. So if we float 2 mana, we have the ability to Key Guardian. Now I'm not really that interested in taking a Key Guardian, so I think I will just chill here. There's not really anything proactive for me to play. The most important thing is just basically lining up your turns. So we've got the Snapper. That's going to be providing us a little bit of value. 1 chip damage might be the best we can do, reasonably speaking. If he's going to be playing like something like an Avaros and Sentry, we can't really get anything more than that. I think I could clear up his card, and 1 chip damage isn't going to do too much. Now, one thing we have to play around is Avalanche. That's very important. So I'm not going to be like over developing another Caretaker into that. Let's go ahead and play Snapper as a 2/5. I think this is fine. There's a legitimate consideration to open attack here instead of developing it as a 2/5, because he wouldn't block with Hawk again, so we'd get 1 face damage guaranteed. By playing Snapper, I probably won't be able to attack with Caretaker anymore. He'll probably play a unit that will make me not attack with Caretaker, like he just did. But I figure, you know, I might be able to attack with Snapper. So we did end up losing out on 1 damage because we didn't take the open attack. Might have been a punish, but it was a very close call between those two. This still might have been the fine play. We'll see. Okay. And then on turn 4, of course, we are in the market for a Kinku Wayfinder. Now, the one thing is that does make it just a bit vulnerable to Avalanche, but now that he's played the Icefield Archer, Avalanche doesn't look as good, right? We really just want to make sure there's no moment where, you know, Avalanche is spectacular. This is a pretty nutty draw. He actually top-decked Archer and Ash off of Omenhawk, and he's got the buffs on top of that. Very spooky stuff. Okay. We have a fairly bricked hand. I'm not really a fan of how this is turning out. I think I kind of have to play Wayfinder right now, and I'm definitely not scared of Avalanche at this point in time. I mean, we definitely don't want me drawing either of these other 2 cards, so we kind of have to play them out right now. He could still take an Avalanche next turn, and that's still not going to be amazing for us, but we've got Deny for it if he were to like line up something good. One big problem with his hand is we don't really have a lot of like barrier usage. He's going to take an attack here, and he's going to get some pretty good value in off of it. So we probably chump the Ash out with Inspiring Mentor. We don't really have great other lines, though. Okay, I'm totally fine with this. This Mentor is not doing too much anyway. Okay, and we're just going to go to round 5. So we are positioned to get some crazy sustained value out of these Green Glade Caretakers, to the point where I think leaving mana open for deny is important. Let's evaluate. We've got 7 mana up. This is a total of 3, leaving 4 up, which is deny plus 1. So Key Guardian into Caretaker could lead us into a position where we could take a fairly aggressive attack. I mean, we'd be able to attack with a couple units here, I'm thinking. Green Glade Duo might be a little bit better, because I think the Caretakers might not be able to attack too much. 7 mana total means we can't use Duo plus Shadow Assassin plus Deny, so that's a little awkward. I think we play Duo plus Caretaker and leave Deny up. Seems to be the best line. I want to get this like 3 chip damage into face. Now, the one thing we're missing here is Key Guardian, and I think that's fine. The thing about these Caretakers is, without more barriers in my hand, I don't really feel comfortable taking aggressive attacks with these yet. I could have played this spot a bit more aggressive. We could have gone in there, but I'm fine just dealing this 3 chip damage and waiting one more turn. I don't really feel like super time pressured, honestly, because I also have a very like late game combo-y deck, and I've got 2 denies in hand that I want to get value out of. So I am thinking that I do want to play like to play this spot a bit slower. So this is very fascinating. He just knocked himself out of avalanche mana, and on top of that, he played a Shaman, which incentivizes us to push down a bit more aggressively. So time to go in. Time to Key Guardian the Caretaker, and basically, you know, we can get out of Deny mana because he's out of Avalanche mana at this point. So now we'll play the Caretaker, I think.
These woods protect their own.
We could have kept the Prismatic Barrier mana in hand open as well. I think that would have been fine, but I'm actually okay losing like 1 or 2 Caretakers. You really don't need them all, and he typically doesn't really have great blocks for these spots at all. I don't really want to let the Ash get too much value, so I think what I'll do is probably swing with all my 3s. I don't see there's a great block lineup here. If I played Snapper into the attack, Ash would survive at 1, and that's no good for me. If I had the threat of a 1-mana spell, if I was a Shadow Isles deck, even if I didn't have Vile Feast in hand, my opponent might not block the Snapper with Ash because they might be worried about Vile Feast, but I'm not in colors that they would even worry about that, right? So attacking with Snapper just means it gets blocked by Ash for free, and he wants to keep Ash alive, so he might not want to, you know, block with any of these. So we'll take this attack with all the 3s. Obviously, the 3/1 can't be blocked because it's elusive. The Rime Tusk Shaman doesn't want to block because it's a value card, so he'll probably block one thing with the Archer, and, you know, maybe with Ash, but probably just Archer and like Chump with Omen Hawk or something like that. Probably on these 2 Caretakers. So he'll probably have a trick for the Ash like Elixir of Iron or Twin Disciplines or something like that. Oh yeah, Flash. I forgot Frostbite's decks just do that instead. Yeah, sure, that's fine. So he plays a combat trick. That's totally fine. No big deal. That's pretty much like the reality of combat tricks. They're always going to threaten that value. You can't really like play scared of them, so you are always going to attack. And sometimes they're able to secure a bit of value. It's basically just a removal spell. No problems there. What? My cat is singing the song of her people.
Nothing escapes my watch.
Okay, Tiny likes the floor. Alright, so we've got a much better position here. Now we're a little bit vulnerable to Avalanche, so keeping Deny mana open is important. We count a total of this, so we can play Shen out here. I think that's just going to be fine. Represents a bit of an additional blocker. He is going to probably take an attack here, and I don't want to like burn mana if he takes like a pass and doesn't attack. So I think this is fine. I'm definitely a little worried about Avalanche here, but again, it's just not ridiculous value in this case, right? So I don't see any problem with this. He takes a pass. I'm pretty happy to burn 1 mana and take this pass back. And we're gonna try to like play for our Caretaker, level up our Shen. All right, Ash takes the level up. Ash can be a pretty spooky card when she levels up. When she like threatens her units from not being able to block. In an ideal world, you know, they wouldn't have an Ash on board. No biggie. So the thought of an open attack, you know, typically you're thinking to yourself, what slow speed threats do they have, right? And we've got Deny to basically counter slow speed threats. So Now that's not necessarily true because a lot of units are slow speed threats, like Rime Tusk Shaman, etc. I do think I might want to get a little bit more value in off of this attack. I don't want him to develop a blocker in this case. So I am just going to go ahead and swing with everything, and I'll just use Shen on the Green Blade Caretaker for now in this case. Give it Barrier because it's the thing that's most important to protect. Of course, from hand, we've got Prismatic Barrier, we've got Double Deny should he try to trick us out. And Barrier will probably hit value. It'll either buff the Green Glade or protect something else. This is a fine setup for me. I don't mind that at all. And we're definitely the aggressor in this situation all of a sudden. So we're probably going to want to protect the Shen. So Barrier is pretty good. And his Rime Tusk is in an awkward position. I think he can't block with this. It's probably too important. Ooh, he's going for it. Okay. So keeping the Shen alive will also deal 2 additional damage to face, which I quite like. Let's go ahead and push this in. So we're going to try to like basically take like an aggressive blowout here. But Ash is a really awkward counter to this, as well as Rime Tusk Shaman. We need to find a way to kill this Shaman, because otherwise our big Caretaker is not really going to be doing enough, right? This guy's only at 10 health, and we really needed him to be at a lot lower. Because the problem here is, we haven't drawn Fiora yet, right? This is a matchup that's pretty rough. If you draw Fiora, you have, ways to be able to clear out without having a super high attack unit. But there's a lot of situations where you might go for a Judgment and they might basically frostbite your Fiora in response to that. That feels bad too. So this is definitely a weak matchup. Let's see what we can pull out here. Because we need like more specific spot removal for the Shaman. And this is why this deck feels like I was saying, a bit of a weaker deck than some others. Because, not having the ability to deal this direct damage is a vulnerability. It would be great if I had a Fiora so I could commit with the Caretaker plan, but use Fiora just as a body here, basically. So this guy thought for a while. He's sitting on 6 unknowns, and he thought for a while before playing anything. There's actually a consideration to pass here and just make sure we're burning his mana. I think he wants to take a fairly reactive play, and he can't Avalanche with a board like this. So I think it's fine to play into. Let's go ahead and play a Shadow Assassin and see what we draw. Also, I mean, I'm safe against Avalanche anyway. There's a Stand United, which is fairly sweet. I might expect him to play a card here. That's a weird float. I'm not sure why he floated that mana, honestly. It kind of just came at a risk of me being bricked out and passing, right? So there's one more barrier, and we've got Stand United, of course. We really need this Shen to level up for our win condition to actually feel there. Shatter. We've got 2 denies in hand that are pretty slow, so if it has 0 power, otherwise frostbite it. If we want to keep a deny up, we can use a barrier. The barrier will buff the Caretaker, and that'll be fine. Frostbite has a lot of like burst speed spells. I think I'll just use a deny here. I feel like I have to play really aggressive. I don't think I'm going to be able to win unless I play very aggressive. So I want to keep my barriers up. I would never do this if it was the last deny in my hand. And it already might be wrong just even having 2. But I feel like it's more important to keep barriers up for either offense or maybe trick purposes. So the big play arounds in this spot are kind of weird because he has a strange deck with Karma in this deck as well. It's like a Frostbite Karma deck. Wow. He's going to deny that. I mean, at this point, I think it's just the barrier spot. Just like I was saying before. Like, I'll just take a barrier. I don't really hate using a barrier here. One thing is if I do want Shen to flip, Stand United before Prismatic Barrier might make a bit more sense. But I think I'll just use it on the Caretaker. In this case, I think that's fine.
Your place is still in the mortal world.
And like I said, I'll keep the last deny up, because it's pretty nice to have 1 deny. So, how this will resolve is the denies cancel each other, and the Shatter is going to effectively frostbite my Caretaker instead of killing it, right? Because it has 0 power. And now I expect him to counter this too. I expect him to frostbite this with brittle steel. Nope, he's gonna let it through. Okay. And that's fine by me. So it is now our turn. We can take a pass. I'm not feeling very vulnerable to anything, and most importantly, I want to keep this deny mana open just in case. So I don't want to play Snapper yet. And he plays Avarosan Sentry. Okay. Sure. I mean, he can't really take an attack in this position here, which is nice. So he has a Crystal Arrow in hand, right? I haven't actually played much against Ash before. Create a Crystal Arrow next round. Isn't this in his hand?
Avarosans, stand together.
Whoa. That's a really aggressive attack. He's not putting me on having a second deny, I think. I'll keep my elusives alive over anything else. Because he's playing to protect this Ash. And if he's bursting, then I can't deny. But okay, sure. I mean, that's fine. I didn't really need that unit anyway. We got a card out of his hand, which is decent. I know he's at 2 mana, so suddenly I don't really need to keep deny mana open. And I will definitely take a Scaled Snapper here. This actually almost might be a situation where I might want to play it for attack power. It's so hard. It's so hard to play it for attack power. It's just so much worse. I don't think I can here. But it's almost close. If his board was a little more narrow, maybe it would be. So we're looking for some kind of like big punch through here. Again, this Rhyme Tusk Shaman is just kind of like nutting all over me. But we might be able to get some kind of cheeky kill with this. So we have 11 mana, which is perfect for our hand. I'll play the duo, and we might be able to lethal him down this turn. Because we've got 1 barrier coming off of Shen. That's going to level him up on the attack declaration. Most importantly, we have a deny. Crystal Arrow. So this frostbites enemies with a certain amount. So I can just go ahead and use this here. One thing to put him on in this deck specifically is the slow 7 mana one, Winter's Breath, I think it's called, that works with Karma. Because if you're running Frostbite Karma, you're probably running Winter's Breath. So it's technically possible that he might have it, but we deny this one because, check this out, we have the attack token now. So even if he has Winter's Breath, he lost his opportunity. It's gone. So big question is what we're using the Shen barrier on. And I think using it on Caretaker ends up making sense. Let's go ahead and get these elusives in, and Shen is going to go ahead and flip off of his own barrier. Now this is important because this means that now that the Shen is flipped, when we use Stand United, both units are going to get +3/+3. And our Caretaker is going to pop off as well, okay? So let's see how these blocks line up. Unfortunately, he's not going to be able to block these elusives, so he's going to block the 3 things he can. And then we're going to use Stand United to swap the Caretaker with one of the elusives he couldn't block. That's going to be the Shadow Assassin probably here, or this duo. And then the Caretaker is going to be able to go face. So when an ally gets barrier, grant me +2. So that will be a total of 10 more attack on our Caretaker. Oh, whoa. That is a crazy block. So we've got 5 damage on board. So we're just a little bit off of lethal, and we will use the Stand United here. I don't know what to play around at this point. I can't actually think of any way he can really stop us. So I'm just going to go ahead and swap. It shouldn't really matter what I swap out, I think. That block kind of like committed him out of a win condition, I think. He needs to basically have a frostbite from hand at this point, and he has nothing. Okay, so we take it through. And that's pretty good. So that's a kind of common occurrence for this deck. This is how this deck is going to finish a lot of the time. Basically, you'll have that kind of like cool punch through moment at the end. So that's it. That is the Fiora OTK like barrier sort of thing, right? And like I said, this is a super fun deck. It plays in a lot of different ways depending on the situation. We don't have Fiora in this case. We didn't draw it in that game, you know. But you guys know what Fiora does. You can imagine how that's going to work out. All right, guys. That's going to be it for me, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.